Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. I will introduce our guest in just a moment. I have a couple of announcements. This Friday, beginning at 10 a.m., we're doing something different, a workshop online. This one is called Unlock Your History. We did it previously with the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. Bob Stakely, our friend there with HCAP. And we'll be helping you to explore your German roots. You do have to register. Send us an email to the library at our web contact, or you can send it to lunchwithbooks@yahoo.com, my email, and we'll get you registered. We have very limited seating for that, so I think maybe 3 or 4 spaces left. This next Tuesday, I should say, we're starting something called Archiving Wheeling Presents Lesser Known Legends of Wheeling. We will begin that series with Joseph Ray, best known for the books Ray's Arithmetic, which were very popular in the 19th and early 20th century as textbooks in school. He was born in the West Liberty area or the Valley Grove area and grew up near Wheeling. So that'll be next. That's Christina Fizanik will be presenting that. Today we're quite honored to have with us the prominent historian and author, Peter Cozzens. His new book is called Tecumseh and the Prophet, and it is the first biography of Tecumseh in several years. Peter is the author of several and editor of 16 acclaimed books on the American Civil War and the Indian Wars of the American West. He is a member of the Advisory Council of the Lincoln Prize. In 2002, he was awarded the American Foreign Service Association's highest honor, the William R. Rivkin Award, given annually to one Foreign Service officer for exemplary moral courage, integrity, and creative dissent. Here is Peter Cozzens.
How do you do? I'm very pleased to be with you virtually today. I should say, by way of introduction, if my assistant, my Labrador, is here with me. So if you hear some barking in the middle of the talk, that means that the mailman has arrived. What I'd like to do is devote perhaps 20 minutes to an overview of my new book, Tecumseh and the Prophet. Here it is. And then do a couple of short readings from the book, very short readings to give you a feel for my writing style. And these readings will reflect episodes in the lives of Tecumseh and his brother, the Shawnee Prophet, that occurred in West Virginia, a very important region in their lives and in the conflicts that surrounded them. When people think of the Indian Wars or of iconic Indian leaders, they invariably look to the American West, as I did when I wrote my previous book, The Earth is Weeping, the epic story of the Indian Wars for the American West. Most people, and I'm afraid even though I'm from Illinois, I have to count myself among them, don't realize, my case didn't realize fully, that the bloodiest and most decisive conflicts between Native Americans and their British allies and encroaching American settlers occurred east of the Mississippi River and north of the Ohio River in what is today the Midwest between 1791 and 1813, or that Indian raids in the West paled beside those that occurred in the Ohio Valley and in the Appalachian Range. By way of example, practically the entire United States Army was wiped out in a single battle in Indiana known as St. Clair's defeat in 1791. It took 80% of the federal budget to finally defeat the Allied Midwestern Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. Now, just 10 years after that, at the dawn of the 19th century, Indian society in the modern Midwest was in shambles. The tribes had been swindled out of vast tracts of land, including most of modern Ohio. They were fragmented, spiritually bereft, shells of their former selves. Only a generation earlier, the entire region had been Indian country. By 1805, however, American land encroachment, poverty, disease, anguish, and alcoholism appeared to be the Indians' fate. And then the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his younger brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, emerged to restore Indian dignity and unity of purpose. They joined with the British in the War of 1812 and came desperately close to changing the course of American history, reshaping the nation's northern boundary, and potentially arresting for a generation or more the tide of Western expansion. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa then were the co-architects of the greatest Indian confederation the Western American Republic would ever confront. Their movement encompassed nearly half of what was then the United States, from the icy upper reaches of the Mississippi River to the steamy bottomlands of the lower Alabama River. No other Indian leaders enjoyed such a broad appeal, and none would ever pose a greater threat to American expansion than did Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. At the height of their appeal in 1813, the Shawnee Brothers mustered, to give you some context, the Shawnee Brothers mustered twice as many warriors as would Chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse on the Little Bighorn River some 3 generations later. The question naturally arises, why has the memory of Tecumseh prospered while his brother has been all but relegated to the dustbin of history? Well, the reasons for this are obvious. Tecumseh would come to personify for Americans of his day and later all that was great and noble in the Indian character as whites then perceived greatness and nobility. Tecumseh advocated a political and military alliance of Indian tribes, which was expanded to include the British in the War of 1812, to oppose United States encroachment on Indian land. This was something that whites could readily comprehend. Tecumseh, who was first and foremost a political leader, acted as they would have acted under similar circumstances. Tenskwatawa, on the other hand, offered a divinely inspired solution to Indian land dispossession and cultural disillusion that drew on native tradition that was beyond white understanding. Tenskwatawa's aspect also repulsed whites. He was an unappealing, disfigured ex-alcoholic who, as a boy, had accidentally shot his right eye out with an arrow. A man devoid of talent or merit, a brawling, mischievous Indian demagogue, according to an Indian agent who knew the Shawnee brothers intimately. The same official admired Tecumseh as the exemplar of Shawnee manhood, a skilled hunter and cunning war leader, charitable, and an orator of rare eloquence. In a similar manner, history, biography, and folklore all came to deify Tecumseh and demonize his brother as a delusional charlatan. Tecumseh and the Prophet, I would argue, is the first work to give Tenskwatawa adequate credit for his role in creating and sustaining the most potent Indian confederacy the United States ever confronted. It was his religious vision and creed that gave rise to the movement. I hope to make readers appreciate the nativist religious fervor that contributed to his emergence and which he shaped into a coherent and compelling doctrine. I address the persuasive evidence that Tecumseh truly believed his brother to be a divinely inspired prophet capable of communing with the master of life or great spirit, and also embrace his creed. These are both critical aspects of the Shawnee Brothers relationship that I explore in Tecumseh and the prophet. What I have attempted in Tecumseh and the prophet then is to redress the gross imbalance in historical perception of the Shawnee brothers, and also to humanize them, make them understandable to people today. Simply put, without Tenskwatawa, there would have been no Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa's program, which aimed at the moral cleansing and spiritual rebirth of a united Indian people, gave rise to the alliance that Tecumseh later built upon for his political and military purposes to protect what remained of Indian land. The relationship between the brothers that emerges in my book is symbiotic in nature. During his lifetime, Tecumseh eventually dominated, but never entirely replaced Tenskwatawa as leader of their pan-Indian confederacy. Indisputably, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa were the most significant siblings in American Indian history. Giving Indians their due, I believe it is only fair to conclude that the Shawnee brothers also were among the most influential siblings in the annals of America. Now, one critical question emerges. Could the Shawnee brothers have prevailed? When I began the project, I entered it with a rather fatalistic approach, a fatalistic attitude. I assumed that their defeat was all but certain, given that the Indians could muster at most 6,000 warriors against the United States, then numbering 10 million people. But I found that I was wrong, that indeed, during the War of 1812, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's alliance, fighting with their British allies, came remarkably close to winning their war, and conceivably having, as I said earlier, redrawn the northern boundaries of the United States, and perhaps given all of Michigan, parts of northern Ohio and Indiana, over to the Indians as a buffer state between British Canada and the United States. That indeed is what the British had promised the Shawnee brothers. So there was a great deal of uncertainty as to whether or not their cause would succeed. It was not by any means a given that they would be defeated. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, West Virginia plays a key role in the book, particularly in the early stages of Tecumseh's career as a young warrior and then as an emerging war leader. Indeed, my book begins, the prologue begins with the Battle of Point Pleasant in West Virginia. And I will read you a couple of brief passages from the prologue, again, to give you a sense of my writing style and an idea of why the Battle of Point Pleasant, which many consider to be the first battle of the Revolutionary War, was so important in the lives of these two men, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. So let us begin with a brief excerpt. Daybreak, October 10th, 1774. In dense forest, a column of 700 Shawnee and Mingo warriors uncoils into a ragged, mile-long line. Unlike years past, the warriors are not stalking game. Rather, they are preparing to strike 1,200 unsuspecting Virginia militiamen camped at Point Pleasant, a craggy triangle at the confluence of the Ohio and Great Kanawha rivers, approximately 150 miles southwest of modern Wheeling, West Virginia. A carpet of red and russet leaves deadens their footfalls. The warriors wear breechclouts, which are single pieces of cloth wrapped around the hips, buckskin leggings, and moccasins. A few also sport linen hunting shirts purchased from white traders. Most carry smoothbore muskets, tomahawks, scalping knives, and bow and arrow for use if their ammunition runs out. Silver rings dangle from their noses. Huge earrings hang on distended earlobes, framing faces painted in fierce patterns of red and black. Let's skip ahead now to the end of the Battle of Point Pleasant, where I reveal why the battle was so important in the lives of these men. It had been a bloody 12 hours. The Indians killed 75 Virginians and wounded another 140. Perhaps 40 warriors died. Hoping to disguise their losses, the Indians rolled several of their dead into the river. The Virginians, nevertheless, collected 32 scalps. These they affixed to a post at Point Pleasant. The battle claimed just one prominent Indian, the Shawnee war leader Puckeshinwau. His 13-year-old son, Chesapeake, not yet a warrior, had accompanied him into action. After Puckeshinwau fell mortally wounded, Chesapeake helped ease him back over the Ohio in a driftwood raft. Before dying, Puckeshinwau reputedly admonished his young son to preserve his family's honor, never reconcile with the Long Knives, as Virginians were called, and in the future lead forth to battle his younger brothers against them. Chesapeake swore to obey. Puckeshinwau's warriors buried their chief deep in the forest. Chesapeake had accepted a heavy burden. He had 3 siblings, and his now widowed mother was pregnant with triplets. Chesapeake's favorite sibling, upon whom he would lavish most of his attention and who would best fulfill his father's last wish, was his 6-year-old brother, Tecumseh, the shooting star. So there, with the death of Puckeshinwau at the Battle of Point Pleasant, Tecumseh is left at age 6, fatherless. His younger brother, Tenskwatawa, not yet born, will never know his father. Continuing on, Tecumseh, as a young war leader, fought 2 of his most audacious raids in present-day West Virginia. One at a place then called Neal Station, which is today Parkersburg, West Virginia, and another along Hackett's Creek, approximately 100 miles south of Wheeling. And I'd like to read a passage describing this raid. It occurred in 1793. By way of context, Tecumseh had just lost a scrape with Simon Kenton, a famous Kentucky frontiersman, and his militiamen, and needed to carry out a revenge raid to maintain his prestige as a war leader, which was a young war leader's greatest asset, especially as he had lost men in the engagement. So let's explore this second raid. With the Kentucky stations on high alert, Tecumseh elected to take his war party deep into the Virginia frontier settlements, a move in keeping with his growing reputation as one of the boldest and most terrible young war leaders. Tecumseh prowled the tranquil farms that lined Hacker's Creek, a meandering watercourse 100 miles east of the Ohio River, searching for a suitable target. On May 7th, he settled on the homestead of 40-year-old Revolutionary War veteran John Wagoner. Twilight had descended, and Wagoner sat on a log near his cabin, resting from a day of plowing and clearing logs. His wife and 7 children milled about the cabin and yard, secreting his warriors in a ravine close to the Wagoner place. Tecumseh crept through the tall grass to within 30 paces of Wagoner. Rising slowly, he fired at the large man silhouetted in the gloam and missed. Tecumseh dropped his musket, grasped his war club, and sprang after Wagoner, who made for the cabin, easily outrunning the limping Tecumseh, but not his warriors, who swept into the yard ahead of Wagoner. Realizing he could do nothing for his family, unarmed, Wagoner sprinted through the fields toward a neighbor's place as the ululations of his unfortunate family grew fainter. By the time Wagoner returned, with a handful of avenging friends, a sickly hush hung over the cabin. Tecumseh had sacked the place. In the yard lay Wagoner's youngest son, tomahawked and scalped. A mile from the cabin, the searchers found another dead child with its brains beaten out. A short distance deeper into the timber, they encountered the mangled bodies of Wagoner's wife and 2 more children. Tecumseh absconded with the remaining 2 daughters and a son. All survived. The boy growing up to replenish the ranks of Shawnee warriors. Jonathan Alder, a longtime captive of the Shawnees, said he once heard Tecumseh reproach a warrior for boasting about the great number of scalps he had taken, calling him a low, mean Indian who preyed mainly on women and children. "I have killed 40 men with my own hand in single combat," Tecumseh purportedly said, "but never yet have I taken the life of a woman or a child." Perhaps not, but his warriors had. That he could have prevented the butchery is doubtful, but it is unclear whether Tecumseh even wished to spare the Wagoners' lives. Everyone at one time or another falls short of their noblest intentions. Now, with that, I know you'll have a lot of questions since the story took place in the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, and in part in Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. So I'd like to open up the floor now for questions and spend the remaining half hour discussing Tecumseh and the Prophet. Okay, the first question I have is from John Greskovich, and John asks, how did the white settlers outnumber the Native Americans to such a great extent. It seems like since they had been there longer, there should have been more Native Americans. By the time Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa created their alliance in 1805, the total number of Indians living in the present-day Midwest, in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region, numbered at most 75,000. These were small tribes in the area: the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, the Ojibwa, the Wyandot, and they had once been much larger. But in the 1600s, the Algonquin tribes, these tribes were all members of the Algonquin-speaking peoples. The Algonquins were decimated by the Iroquois, who swept through the Ohio country and displaced, shattered, and killed many of the members of these tribes. Then came the British colonists, whose diseases, smallpox, influenza, and so forth, again decimated the ranks of those Indians who remained. So that really by the early 1800s, late 1700s, there were very few, relatively speaking, Indians remaining in the Midwest. I mean, they claimed these huge swaths of land, but numerically they were only about 75,000 people. And by this point, the United States had grown to approximately 10 million people, far too many really to live prosperously between the Atlantic coast and the Appalachian Range. So already tens of thousands had spilled across the Appalachians. Kentucky, Tennessee had already been well settled, as had southern Ohio. So the Indians, although they had a great deal of land numerically, they were no match for the white settlers alone. Confederated, they could give battle to the best that the Americans could bring to bear, but separately, they never stood a chance. Next question. Have you seen the outdoor drama Tecumseh held near Chillicothe, Ohio? And if so, what is your opinion of it? No, I haven't seen it. In fact, sadly, I had plans to go to Chillicothe to see it this past summer on my way to Chicago to visit family. And of course, we all know what intervened this summer, and so I didn't travel. So I can't speak to its accuracy or anything about it. I visited the historic sites, of course, at least those that still exist, that relate to Tecumseh and the Prophet and to Tecumseh's battles with the British in 1812, including, of course, Tippecanoe, Prophetstown. And the place that I most highly recommend is Fort Meigs in northern Ohio at the mouth of the Maumee River. For any of you that have an opportunity to travel to northern Ohio, it's well worth a visit. Fort Meigs is a 2-acre stockade that was built by William Henry Harrison in 1813, specifically as a marshaling place for his army and to keep the Indians and their British allies at bay and out of northern Ohio. And there was a major battle fought between Tecumseh and his British allies and William Henry Harrison at Fort Meigs in May 1813, very dramatic battle. And the stockade has been rebuilt, reconstructed to its 1813 appearance, and it's a remarkable site and really well worth a visit. It's the finest Indian War stockade I've ever seen, either east of the Mississippi or out west. Next question. This is from Pam. I hope I pronounced this right. Usiak. She asks, the Indians are always portrayed as savage. It is safe to say that both sides were, but the Indians were forced to defend their land. Yeah, absolutely. I, there was equal, as you say, equal savagery displayed by both sides. And one of the things that emerges quite clearly, both in Tecumseh and the Prophet, and in my prior book on the Indian Wars of the West, is that the Indians never, I mean, I could say this with great sureness, the Indians never provoked a war. They fought to defend their lands, to defend their way of life, and generally resorted to war as a last resort. In fact, Tecumseh and his brother, they acquiesced in the numerous fraudulent, semi-fraudulent land treaties that William Henry Harrison negotiated with the Indians between 1803 and 1805. They did not dispute the great loss of their lands that had already occurred, but said, okay, we draw a line here, and no further. Even after Harrison negotiated another bogus treaty in 1809, despite the warnings of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa that they would be forced to retaliate to defend what remained of their lands. The Indians did not respond militarily. It was not until Harrison launched a preemptive strike against their village of Prophetstown on Indian land in 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe, that the fighting actually began. So indeed, you're right. Equal savagery in combat on both sides, and the Indians really fought only when provoked and only as a last measure. Question from Aaron Denise Rothenbuehler. Why has the role Tenskwatawa played in the Pan-Indian Alliance been underplayed, historically speaking? Again, I addressed that briefly in my remarks. I think it's partly because his religious dogma, the creed that he espoused, was again so foreign to whites. It was again entirely in keeping with native beliefs. One aspect of his creed that is overplayed or has been overplayed by historians traditionally, who seek to portray him as a charlatan, is his not only his admonitions against witchcraft, but his role in the execution of a number of Delaware Indians for witchcraft. He's gotten a raw deal from that. Witchcraft and the fear of witches was fundamental to the Midwestern Indians' belief system. In fact, well into the early years of the 20th century, the modern Shawnee, still incorporated aspects of witchcraft, beliefs in witchcraft into their cultural thinking. And of course, Americans of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's day had nothing to brag about. I mean, the Salem witchcraft trials weren't that far removed in American history at that time. So I think it's for that reason, partly, and it's a failure just to really look at the primary sources, to what actually happened. I mean, the British were still, until the outbreak of the War of 1812, they were still referring to Tecumseh as the prophet's brother. So for the better part of the alliance, this is the life of the alliance, Tenskwatawa was the leading figure, and it was his religious creed that came from this remarkable cataleptic trance that he had, this mystical trance that created the alliance upon which Tecumseh would build to protect Indian land. And it's quite clear, again, from the contemporary sources, that the two played a symbiotic role in the alliance right up until Tecumseh's death, the Battle of the Thames in 1813. He was by then, without a doubt, I mean, the preeminent military leader of the alliance. But without Tenskwatawa's uniting creed, it would have been less cohesive and coherent. This is from Aaron Carey. I've read many differing accounts about the mother of Tecumseh, Tenskwatawa, etc. Some say she was Creek, some Cherokee, some say white. What did you find in your research about this? I found pretty conclusively from sources that were very reliable, including a young man named Stephen Riddell, who was captured by the Shawnee when he was 12 during a raid in Kentucky. And when Tecumseh was also 12, he and Tecumseh became inseparable friends. From him, Tecumseh learned much of his English, and they spent the next approximately 15, 16 years together. Riddell became a devoted follower and warrior with Tecumseh. And from Riddell's account of their time together and those of other contemporaries, it's clear that Tecumseh's mother, in fact, was a Shawnee. I guess, there's any number of myths have arisen about Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. And one of them is the myth that his mother may have been Creek or may even have been white. But I have no doubt that she was Shawnee, as was his father. I think some of the confusion arises because she and Tecumseh's father, Pukeshinwa, they lived among the Creeks in northern Alabama. See, when the Shawnee broke apart after they were pushed out of the Ohio country by the Iroquois, they dispersed into parts of modern Maryland, parts of Virginia, and as far south as northern Alabama, where several bands of Shawnee were welcomed by the Creeks and had their own villages in what is today northern Alabama. In fact, Pukeshinwa's first wife indeed was Creek, but his second wife and the mother of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa was, without a doubt, Shawnee. This is from John Greskovich. Don't wish to dominate your presentation. I emailed you last night. 99% sure I am a direct descendant of Tecumseh. Any thought on who I could contact to verify final pieces, i.e. was Catherine Matilda Trader his granddaughter? John, like I said last night, John sent me a very interesting question asking if this young man whose name was Pukesa, I forget the exact, without Pukesa passing through or passing above, Trader may have been Tecumseh's son. And I responded that Tecumseh did have one son whose name indeed was Pukesa, but that I, beyond the fact that his son migrated with the Shawnees west to modern day Kansas in the early 1830s, I don't know what happened to his son afterwards in life. But John, I would suggest maybe contacting the Shawnee directly, the Shawnee people and see if in their tribal records they may have some information on him. I really don't offhand, because again, I concluded my book with the death of Tenskwatawa, who outlived Tecumseh by 2 decades. But it sounds given the fact that they have the same names, it sounds like there's a real possibility there. So, good luck in your endeavors. General question from Wentworth Books. How did the Shawnee come to be allies of the British? Forgive me if you covered this. No, the Shawnee were allies of the British going way back. They were going back to the mid 1700s. They allied themselves with the British. The British provided trade goods, did not attempt to encroach on their lands, encouraged the Shawnee to reunite in the Ohio Valley, and endeavored to keep their colonists east of the Appalachians and out of Indian land. There was a brief period during the French and Indian Wars when the French were able to seduce the Shawnee to taking their side, and the Shawnees in the late 1750s and early 1760s launched raids with their French allies against American settlements in what is today West Virginia and the Appalachians and the Shenandoah Valley. Then came Pontiac's War, when the Shawnee fought against the British. But after the defeat of the French in the French Indian Wars, they grudgingly reconciled themselves to the British presence. And when the Revolutionary War broke out, the Shawnees attempted to remain neutral, but the Americans provoked conflict with them by killing a couple of prominent Shawnee war leaders who actually were Shawnee chiefs, who were actually trying to maintain the peace. And so the Shawnees threw in with the British as the lesser of two evils. After the British defeat in the Revolutionary War, the British ceded the lands west of the Appalachians to the Americans, which mortified the Indians because they never considered the British to have any claims over those lands, and relations cooled. But once again, we entered the 1780s, and the Americans began pushing west to the Appalachians, and again, encroaching on Indian land. The Indians reestablished their ties with the British, and they maintained it was an alliance of mutual interest against a common foe. I mean, the British wanted to keep United States at bay as best they could without bringing on war, and having a strong Indian presence in the Great Lakes region and the Ohio country was a good guarantor of that. So it was an alliance that it was basically the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they came together in the War of 1812 again with the common interest in arresting American encroachment in the Midwest. The Indians, of course, so as to keep their land, what remained to them, and the British, in order to create an Indian buffer state between the United States and British Canada. And again, that alliance crumbled after the British defeat in the War of 1812. So the British had kind of a habit of letting them down in their most dire moments. How can people get this book, and what is your next project? This book's available, of course, at Barnes and Noble or Amazon, or I'm sure at independent booksellers in Wheeling. It's readily available, and obviously, I encourage you to buy it. Not only do I hope you'll enjoy the writing in the book, but one of the things that really pleased me was the wonderful job that the publisher did with the illustrations of the book. There are 40 illustrations in full color, which you don't see much these days in books. So I was very excited about that. My next project is tentatively titled Red Sticks and Old Hickory, The Creeks, Andrew Jackson, and the heroic struggle for the American South. And it really builds on Tecumseh and the Prophet, because Tecumseh, as part of his efforts to build a pan-Indian alliance, journeyed south of the Ohio River and spent 6 months among the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek Indians, trying to bring them into, again, this common alliance against the United States, to try to convince them of their mutual interest in arresting American expansion. He didn't have a lot of success. In fact, the only place he managed to plant a seed was among the Creeks. And that seed grew and led first to the Creek Civil War in 1811, and ultimately to the Creek War against the United States in 1813 and 1814, which then led to the displacement of Indians from the American South west of Mississippi and Jackson's Trail of Tears. So what that book will do is complete what I would, I guess, call informally my American Indian, my Native American trilogy. I kind of began it backwards chronologically with The Earth is Weeping, which covers Indian wars in the West, mostly post-Civil War, up until Wounded Knee. And then I stepped back and realized, as I said earlier in my talk, that a lot happened in the Midwest, and it seemed only natural to tell that story, which I seek to do in Tecumseh and the Prophet, which is not only a dual biography of these men, but also a larger story of the conquest of the old Northwest, present day Midwest, and then follow the third volume on the struggle for the American South. So that will wrap up, to say, my informal trilogy on the on wars against the American Indians. Trivia question: do you know the origin of the place name Wheeling? Okay, you got me. Go ahead, Sean.
Jump back in. Yeah, it comes from a Lenape or Delaware word meaning skull place or place of the skull, Wheelunk, and it was named after the fact that a white man was decapitated and his head placed on a stake near Wheeling Creek. So, yeah, we have a pretty storied indigenous history here, with Fort Henry and all of that. So
right.
That was an excellent presentation. I wasn't trying to stump you at the end.
Oh, that's interesting, Sean. I always like to learn something new. And of course, that harkens back to, I think, Pamela's question about the mutual barbarity. You have the white man's skull stuck on a post,
right,
on Wheeling Creek, and then you have the Virginia militia sticking the scalps of the dead Shawnee on posts at Point Pleasant. So it went both ways.
Yeah. Well, excellent presentation. Thank you.
Sean.
Just seeing if there are any more questions. It looks like everyone's just complimenting you, and really appreciate it, Peter. Thanks for taking time to be with us.
My pleasure, folks. And I do hope you read the book and enjoy it. And just to kind of give away my favorite part of the book and what has most intrigued me, actually is, I tried to bring these two men to life as human beings. I mean, every aspect I could of their characters, everything from their sense of humor to their sexual lives, to their personalities, to their brotherly jealousies. And what struck me viscerally the most was Tenskwatawa, and how he, in the course of a single vision, went from being this inept, ne'er-do-well alcoholic who was perpetually drunk, sponging off Tecumseh, into overnight an absolute teetotaler who came to espouse this remarkable creed that merged nativist tradition along with aspects of Christianity as he knew them. And all this occurred through initially one division, then a subsequent division, and all in a matter of weeks. It's a remarkable story of a man's transformation that I still find absolutely mystifying. So I hope you do get the book and enjoy it.
I'll certainly be getting it. And thanks again, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Sean.
Who attended today. And reminder, Friday is our workshop on German ancestry. If you'd like to sign up, send us an email. Okay, we will see you next time. Thanks. Goodbye.
Okay, take care.